I saw a few police chases going on while I was there. The funniest one that I saw one police officer running after a suspect, and for whatever reason, he decided to use a can of pepper spray to apprehend a subject while he was running behind him, which meant that all of that pepper spray just went right back into his face. That poor officer. I feel for him. I very much feel for him. Pepper spray is awful. Some of the food that I really liked, definitely shawarmas. It's kind of like a burrito, or actually no, more like a hero, but it also has French fries in it and a couple of different special sauces. It was really good. A lot of Romanians will probably try to say that they're also pretty spicy, but I kind of think that their definition of spicy may not quite hit American standards of spicy. Really not spicy at all. But shawarmas were a pretty good, almost fast food item that I ate quite a bit, and they were delicious. As far as holiday foods, sarmale, it's kind of like their traditional go-to for just about any kind of holiday meal. They're basically cabbage leaves filled with rice, meat, and a couple of different spices and boiled in a giant pot. They're also just absolutely phenomenal. As far as breakfast foods, you have mamaliga, which is kind of like a staple of a Romanian diet. Kind of like a pudding made out of cornmeal. Almost. There are a couple of different ways to sweeten it up and make it a really good breakfast dish. Some strange foods that I could find in Romania. Salted pork fat was one. Every now and then I would get offered that when I would talk to different Romanians if they offered me some food. The consistency of the salted pig fat was something kind of close to cured bacon, just without the meat. Typically you'd eat that on just a dry piece of bread with a slice of raw onion, and that's the traditional way to eat salted pork fat. That is definitely a very different type of meal. One person, just as a gift, gave us about 3 pounds of it. It sat in our fridge for a minute. Another different meal that I ate is ciorba de burtă, which is basically a stomach soup. It's actually surprisingly pretty good, but definitely not something that I would eat on a regular basis. Some other foods that I had while I was in Romania, mici was pretty good, and it's basically, if you take sausage but don't have the wrapping around it. So it's basically the insides of your sausage just fried up. It's actually really, really good. Really good with hot mustard. For one of my birthdays one year while I was out there, a couple of friends of mine that I met while I was in Romania took me out to this restaurant. It was like this giant sausage of the Romanian variety. Because mici literally means smalls, but the joke was that these were not small. It was actually a really, really good time at dinner. I was out trying to talk with different people inside of this large apartment complex. We called it a block. This particular block was just entirely filled with old, retired people. They were not terribly happy that we were knocking on different apartment doors inside this apartment complex. Also with the setup of blocks and apartment buildings in general, they're really echoey and have this big central hallway. So if I'm knocking on a door on the top of this apartment complex, pretty much everyone can hear that I'm knocking on the door. And we were just going door to door. And eventually everybody started getting the idea that we're knocking on every single door, and they weren't happy with that. And a whole bunch of old people chased us out with their canes and chased us out of the building. I feel like it's wrong to say, but it was a little bit funny to see these really old people hobbling after us with canes, telling us, "You young boys, get out, please." Felt a little bad, but at the same time, my companion and I had a little bit of a laugh at the same time. Around Christmas time, a lot of priests from the Romanian Orthodox Church will go around baptizing people's apartments. It's kind of a Christmas time tradition in Romania that they do. They knocked on our apartment door. We invited them in, and we got to share some juice with them, and we were just talking and having a nice time, and then they went on their way. It was a really nice moment. I don't know, I think Christmas time just generally brings out the best in people. I thought that was a pretty touching moment. Around Easter time, they have a lot of different traditions, and so we went to a midnight mass just to kind of check that out. Everyone in the city basically brings a candle to midnight mass, and they'll have a whole little ceremony, and then they light the candle up, and everyone passes kind of like a flame to everybody in the audience, and then everyone just takes that candle home. And so basically throughout the entire city where I was at, everyone was just on buses and trains just with all of these lit candles everywhere. In hindsight, kind of surprised that nothing caught fire, but it was actually a really cool thing to see. Also around Easter time, they have a tradition where everyone hard boils an egg and you dye it red, and then they almost have like a competition. Everyone will have a hard-boiled egg basically on that day, and you just knock eggs with the person and one of the eggs will break and the other one just doesn't, and it's almost like a competition to see how long you can go without having your egg break. That was a pretty interesting tradition that I thought was really cool. Some things that I love and admire about the Romanians and their culture, they're really direct. They'll tell you absolutely what they're thinking, when they're thinking it. So you don't have to really question kind of where you stand with people. If they don't like you, they'll tell you, hey, I'm sorry, this isn't for me, and you can be on your way. Sometimes that can be awkward when they're like, hey, Elder, you should really lose a few pounds. You're getting a little fat. Then you get very, self-conscious and okay, well, all right. At the same time, it's kind of refreshing not have the same level of duplicity that sometimes you can find in American culture. That was definitely something that I really, really admired. Some other aspects of Romanian culture, I really like that basically everything is kind of within walking distance. There's a store you want, or if you want to go meet up with somebody, everything's pretty close by. Even if you don't have a car, you can still get there relatively easy. If you're traveling anywhere long distance within the country, you travel by train. I actually really miss train rides. Everything in America, if you're going long distance, you're basically flying in an airplane. I think a train is kind of a really cool way to travel. A lot of times, if you really get to know someone out there, they'll help you out just in any way they can. My second birthday while I was in the country, I was feeling a little bit lonely because I had just moved to a new city. I didn't really know anybody there, and a couple of the people that I knew from Bucharest, they came out to just wish me happy birthday and spend the day with me, and they didn't have to do that, but they really care about you. Some different aspects about Romanian culture from American culture, at least with the language, they always seem to have a phrase for just about any topic of conversation. If I were talking about, if I were married, there's Casa de Piatra, which basically has the meaning of I hope your marriage, lasts long, a house of stone, that it's not going to crumble. If you're talking about your kids, să vă trăiască, may your kids live to you, like hope your kids have a long life. If it's cold outside, e frig bocna. Basically, any situation, there is some kind of phrase that goes along with that topic of conversation. I always thought it was fascinating. And so I tried to learn as many different phrases as I could just so that I could kind of keep up, because they kind of come out of nowhere when people say them and you're just like, wait, what does that mean? Oh, okay, this is what that means. Sometimes if you're even at least like remotely known to another person, when they greet you, they'll kiss you on the cheeks. For me, like initially that was kind of like a huge culture shock, because I'm just not used to people getting that close into my personal space. And in general, our sense of personal space in the US is definitely a lot different from a Romanian sense of personal space. They will get very, very close to you, and that took a little bit of getting used to. Romanians definitely have a lot more pride in their language compared to Americans. I know, especially as I was learning the language, they almost felt like it was impossible that any outsiders could learn their language that was kind of unique to Romanians, that no one else would bother to learn their language, more or less. So, kind of an interesting thing there. A lot of times they just try to speak English to me, especially at the beginning, whereas I feel like here in America, we just kind of expect everyone else to learn English versus the other way around. I thought that was an interesting thing. Yes, there were definitely plenty of language mix-ups on my mission. One of the more embarrassing mix-ups that I was also definitely set up by my companion for. I went into a store and my companion asked me to find the jam in the store. Now in Romanian, the word for jam is conservative, but the word that he told me to ask for was prezervative, which in English there's preservatives, which is a type of jam. And so I really didn't think anything of it. I asked the store clerk where I could find prezervative, and he handed me a box of condoms, because that's what preservative, that's what that means. And yes, I was absolutely embarrassed, and my companion was laughing the whole time. Yeah, that happened. A lot of these language mix-ups happen at the grocery store. I was trying to ask for lemons, which the word for lemon is Lemoye. I was terrified because I knew this mix-up, and I was terrified to say the word wrong, because if you say Lemoye a little bit slower, it sounds like a swear word in Romanian. I was so convinced I was going to get it right. I wasn't going to say it wrong, but I said the word a little bit too slowly, and I said the wrong thing. And you could just see people just turn and stare at me, and I was like, no, I said the wrong thing. I'm just gonna cut my losses. I'm gonna leave now. That was a great one. One other language mix-up that was definitely a lot more innocent. I was on the phone setting up an appointment, and I had just finished the whole conversation. We had this appointment set up for 2 days from then, and I told the lady on the phone that I was talking to, Te doresc o seară bună. I was supposed to say, Îți doresc o seară bună. The reflexive pronoun was what I needed to say, but I did not say that. I used the objective, which meant instead of saying, I wish to you a good evening, I said, I want you good evening. My companion laughed at me for a while. We had the appointment, and she laughed at me for a minute. But there's plenty of things in the Romanian language that you can say incorrectly. It's a fun language to learn. Definitely different aspect of Romanian culture. There are lots of street dogs in Romania. I don't feel like you really see a lot of street dogs here in America. Most of the time, if there's a feral dog living in the city, it'll get scooped up by animal control or some poor police officer somewhere. But as far as Romania, there's just packs of dogs just going around the city, and sometimes, people just kind of take them in and feed them on the street, and it's kind of like, this is the street dog of this area. And I also feel like with Romanian culture, anytime people are out in public, they take a lot more pride in their appearance than we probably do as Americans. People will be dressed up. They'll have really nice shiny shoes. You're not really going to see that many dirty shoes unless they just barely stepped into like a fresh patch of mud. And even then, they'll probably take the time to clean off their shoes right away. There's a lot more polishable shoes that you see in public in Romania. And if you're in any kind of business out there, pretty much you're going to see them wearing some kind of suit or some kind of button-up shirt. Whereas out here, I feel like if you enter a business, unless it's a really high professional business, most people are probably going to be dressed in just normal, comfortable, lounge-about clothes. You definitely, at least in the large cities in Romania, you definitely see a lot more just open drug use. That was a little bit eye-opening for me. I never really felt like I was unsafe at any time in their country. Nobody ever attacked me. Nobody did anything to make me feel like, I should stay home at any hour of the night. I felt pretty safe. Then again, that could also have to do with the fact that I'm kind of a giant. But even with friends and people that I talked to, never really heard of any stories of anyone getting beaten up recently or anything like that. I never worried about being safe anywhere that I went to. I just felt comfortable going absolutely anywhere. Even when I went into places that were definitely high poverty areas, no one made me feel unsafe, which I definitely can't say the same about different places here in the US. Even with different types of crime possibly being higher there, I never felt like I was going to be a victim of violent crime. I also felt like they had kind of different standards when it comes to modesty. Like all of their tabloids, you could definitely see a lot of open nudity just out there. That was definitely a very different experience from what you're used to in the US. I think probably one of the main differences that you'd see with living in Romania versus living in the States, it wouldn't really necessarily be what things you can buy or get out there, because anything you could buy in the States you can buy in Romania. But as far as the living situation, I'd say the overwhelming majority of people live inside of apartments. I'd say very, very few people live inside of just standalone homes, whereas I feel like out here in the US we have a lot of space, and so living inside of a home isn't really an uncommon thing. But in Romania there are plenty of people that just live their entire lives in apartments, and occasionally there will be a few people that live just outside of a city inside of a standalone home, but even then they're usually much smaller than your typical American sized home. So everything's a lot more compact and condensed. Another interesting thing about that, though, with keeping everything compact like that, they're able to preserve a lot of their older buildings. Instead of tearing them down to build something new, you can have these really old buildings that just kind of stand out from a lot of the newer structures. Like a lot of older churches, they'll have left alone, and they definitely stick out. And it's kind of eye-catching when you see one, because you'll walk around and you'll kind of have this apartment complex that's just like a solid concrete brick that's just standing super tall, and then you walk and there's a super ornate building just in the middle of nowhere, and you're like, yep, that's definitely an older building. At least with the U.S., we're just constantly rebuilding everything, and there really isn't anything old out here. My experience learning Romanian was definitely the first Latin-based language that I'd ever learned, and I feel like a lot of people, especially in America, kind of feel like Romanians generally speak Russian and have a Russian-based language, but really it's a Romance language. I found that to be definitely interesting. Honestly, like speaking Romanian every single day, I caught on, at least to the basics, fairly quickly. Obviously, I had a horrible accent, as many people very bluntly told me, but I feel like that also got better over time. I feel like at about a year into my mission, I could speak really well, but those first couple of months were a struggle. I spent about just shy of a year of my mission in one spot in the capital of Bucharest. It was kind of interesting, but at the same time it was good because I got to learn that style of Romanian. As I found out through my mission, different areas of Romania have different dialects and has these subtle yet noticeable changes with how people speak. The next area that I went after serving in the capital, I went to a place called Craiova, which that city alone has its own special past tense that really only they use. Basically, if something happened during that day, they would use this special past tense to just imply in the past, but in the past 24 hours this happened, which I thought that was pretty interesting. So like if I was in Bucharest, ți-a plăcut ceva, but if I was then in Craiova, îți placu would be the same way to say that same thing, like did you like it? There were a lot of interesting different aspects of the language, and there was always something more you could learn. I really did my best to try to learn it. For the first little bit, it was really hard because everyone just tried to establish that level of communication, and so instead of just speaking in Romanian, they would try to just speak English to me since that was something that I could do. And I basically had to force people to speak Romanian with me initially to make sure that I kept learning the language. As far as accents go, good accents, bad accents, I don't know that I've necessarily maintained my good accent. I haven't spoken Romanian consistently in over 11 years now at this point. But to say like, îmi pare bine, that would be kind of like a bad accent, where you're kind of having like a hard R sound. Îmi pare bine. You're pronouncing things way more American with how those different vowel sounds would sound versus how Romanian would say it, where it's îmi pare bine. That would be a lot better of an accent, but still probably not that great. A heartfelt message to the Romanian people. Just during the 2 years that I was in your country, I fell in love with the people around me. Everyone was, generally speaking, pretty kind. I got to see some different things, just how people lived in a different part of the world. In general, people were very accepting of me, and I got to see a different side of people that I never would have had the chance to if I wasn't there. And to all the people that let me into their homes, and even on days where I wasn't having as great of a day, just took a moment out of their time to cheer me up. It really meant a lot to me. I'm grateful to have had the time to be around you and to experience the warmth and vibrancy of your culture, to see your different traditions that were foreign to me, and as an American, things that I would have never been able to see otherwise. I appreciate being able to take part in those traditions and those cultures, and I really appreciate the people that made a lot of those opportunities possible. In special, one great friend that really did a lot of that, Ilie Mondoiu. I really appreciate everything he did. Just helped me experience Romania much more fully than I possibly could have on my own. I loved the time that I was there in Romania, and I'm grateful that I get to express that to you.